musicians can continue to do so at the end of this transition period. It's critically important that the cultural excellence that so many UK musicians are responsible for continues to be available to European nations, and whether it's the Bayreuth Festival or pop concerts in Belgium, we need to make sure that British talent has a chance to shine.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that an agreement on a future relationship by the end of the year is perfectly feasible, and that the EU and its negotiators need to recognise the reality of a sovereign, independent United Kingdom with a strong, dynamic economy?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of EU leaders who have said that a deal is doable because we're operating on the basis of precedent. Then it should be possible to conclude all the necessary agreements. And I should say that having concluded these agreements by the end of this year, we can then move on to deepening the many bilateral and multilateral relationships that we have with our friends and partners in Europe to the benefit of all.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The right honourable gentleman referred to other deals that he is hoping to emulate. He will be aware that the EU's deal with South Korea took 8 years from the start of negotiations to implementation, and the Canada deal 7 years. Given that the government is seeking a much more comprehensive arrangement than either of those, may I say to him, the proof will be whether his optimism that it can be done and ratified in 10 months remains to be proven. But can he just confirm to the House that if it is not possible to conclude a deal, then we will exit the transition period on the 31st of December with no agreement whatsoever?
Well, we already have an agreement. We have a withdrawal agreement that safeguards the rights of UK and EU citizens, that settles our financial obligations and makes provisions through the protocol for Northern Ireland's position. So we already have an agreement. With respect to the free trade agreements to which he refers, it's obviously more difficult to begin when you are designing a prototype. Now that these prototypes exist and they are no longer prototypes but precedents, it is much, much easier to replicate their provisions.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the last question, some 2 years ago, I attended a presentation complete with slides given by Mr. Michel Barnier, at which he indicated that as things then stood, the only post-Brexit trading arrangements available to the UK were those enjoyed by South Korea and, of course, Canada, which is precisely the relationship that the government is seeking. Since then, the EU seems to have resigned from that position. Does my right honourable friend know why the EU is apparently showing such bad faith?
There are, as my right honourable friend, having said with distinction in government, knows, a range of views across the European Union, but they have now concluded their mandate with unanimity, and we are confident that we can negotiate using our approach and their mandate to reach an appropriate deal similar to the one that he has outlined.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, I have often in this place referred to the concerns of the Highland tourism industry, in particular hotels, about the continuing employment of EU nationals, many of whom are heading homewards, and also the concerns of fish processors in terms of getting their fresh produce to European markets in good time. I wonder if the Secretary of State, who's a good Scot, would consider coming to the Highlands to meet with representatives of these industries. He would be most welcome.
I'd be delighted so to do. Any opportunity to visit the honourable gentleman's constituency is a welcome one. He is absolutely right that the hospitality industry is integral to the success of the Highlands economy, and we want to make sure that in the future that those who provide such a high standard of hospitality have access to the skilled labour they need.
Steve Double.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and his very clear message regarding fisheries. But he will know that memories run very deep in our fishing communities, and there is continued great concern because of the way that the fishing industry was treated previously. So will he make absolutely clear to the fishermen in Cornwall and around the country that access to our fishing waters will not be used as a bargaining chip to trade off against other priorities?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Memories of what happened in the 1970s certainly run deep, and for very good reason. And that is why I sought to stress in my remarks that we, as an independent sovereign state, regard control of our own resources as something which we cannot barter away. Of course, we want to cooperate in the management of stocks with our neighbours, but the approach that we will take will be similar to that of other sovereign states or sovereign regimes like Norway, Iceland, and the Faroes, and as an independent coastal state, we will regulate access to our own waters on our terms.
Sir George Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Right Honourable Member for Surrey Heath's commitment to try to secure a comprehensive free trade agreement? Will he accept, though, that many of my constituents who work in the automotive industry are seriously worried about the impact of a potential 10% tariff on motor vehicles? And will he undertake to give a firm commitment to make sure that their interests are as protected as much as possible?
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for making that point. Throughout his time in the House, he's been a strong and consistent and powerful voice for the rights of workers. He's absolutely right that those who work in our automotive sector deserve the best possible future, and it's for that reason that we will seek to avoid any tariffs on cars or on automotive products.
Mary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British farmers are proud to produce food to the highest standards, and the British consumer benefits from this. Can my right honourable friend reassure the farmers and the consumers of my constituency of Broadland that these high standards will be maintained in any free trade agreements?
Absolutely. The agriculture bill, which was being introduced by my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, which is being carried, whose tenure as Environment Secretary was outstanding, and which is being carried forward by my right honourable friend, the current Secretary of State, will ensure that farmers have a firm foundation on which to plan for the future. It is also the case in all our trading relationships that we will make sure there are appropriate protections for the environment and for animal welfare to ensure that the peerless standards which are set by our farmers are used as a badge of excellence to enable them to do even better in the future.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, in relation to fishing, can the Secretary of State confirm that fishing fleets and fish processors in Portavogie, my constituency, but also in our Glasgow, Kiel and elsewhere, will have the same rights as their fellow fishing fleets and processors in Scotland, Wales and England, and that Northern Ireland will not be disadvantaged by the border down the Irish Sea?
There will be no border down the Irish Sea, and the fishing fleets of Northern Ireland will enjoy all the rights that they deserve, similar, indeed identical, to those of other fishermen and fishers across the United Kingdom.
Crab.
Mr. Speaker, striking a deal is far easier and far more likely from a position of strength. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that, in contrast to 2017, going into these negotiations with clarity, unity, backed up by a strong electoral mandate, should give us all reasons for optimism, not pessimism?
Oh, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. And I've said before from this dispatch box that when you had a 52-48 referendum, when you have 650 different views in this House, not everyone will be satisfied with every aspect of our negotiating approach. But with a united government, a clear approach, a general election mandate, and also with this document being underpinned by clear work by lawyers, trade negotiators and others, I believe that we can secure a deal. And I'm sure that across this House, everyone recognises that we should not make our own personal perfect the enemy of the common good.
Matt Fadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The statement and the document published today shows that the government has made a fundamental choice, which is to prioritise sovereignty over any economic argument or consequence, either for goods or for services. But isn't the danger here that, having made this choice, the government imposes economic consequences for the long term on the country in pursuit of the prize of a sovereignty which it ends up not using very much, because at the end of the day, good standards in environmental and labour market and consumer sectors actually make sense?
The right honourable gentleman always makes a thoughtful contribution to our debates, and I do take his point. And it will be for this Parliament and for future Parliaments to decide how our sovereignty is exercised in accordance with the wish of the British people. But the experience of history tells us that those countries which have the maximum amount of control over their own destiny are the best equipped to succeed economically and indeed to ensure a greater degree of equity for all their citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend recognise the distinction between EU regulations and European technical standards, the latter of which are set outside the EU and without a loss of sovereignty by expert bodies, of which the British Standards Institution is one of the most respected and admired in the world? And does he share my hope that British standards expertise will continue to be able to influence European and international standards?
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point, which reflects the brilliant work that he did in government as business secretary. It is absolutely the case that there are common technical standards in which British experts play a distinguished part, and we will want to ensure, and I know that others will want to ensure, that those common standards can help underpin successful commerce and trade.
Jonathan Reynolds.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister began by saying the government is not asking for anything which doesn't already exist in an existing agreement between the EU and another country, but then gave an answer on financial services, which the document backs up, saying the government is seeking this enhanced equivalence, comprehensive equivalence regime for our major sector. And the two things, Minister, respectively, cannot be true. There is not one single equivalence regime, it's a patchwork of regulations, and there are major bits of legislation with no equivalence provisions in at all. The cross-border payments regulation, Motor Insurance Distribution Directive, the Single European Payments Area. None of these have equivalence provisions, so we respectfully are asking for something additional, and one of the answers the Minister's given isn't really correct.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his thoughtful intervention, but all we are seeking is straightforward equivalence in financial services, and that is something that the European Union has said that they will review, and we will know the conclusions of that review by June.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. What an excellent statement from the Secretary of State outlining our principles. But could he give me the assurance that the principles will not change when the EU says no to something? Because over the last few years I've listened to excellent speeches from that dispatch box, only to find our principles changed when the EU said no to something.
I am a restless seeker after consensus, wherever it can be found, but more important than that, I'm a Democrat. The British people were clear in the referendum and clear again in the general election. They wanted us to leave the European Union. The Prime Minister made clear in the general election, as he did during the referendum campaign, that meant leaving the single market, leaving the customs union and leaving the jurisdiction of the ECJ, and we will not move from those principles.
Jonathan Edwards.
Regrettably, the British Government, in its statement today, has decided to take a belligerent approach to the second phase of Brexit negotiations. Its opening move is to try and reopen the agreement reached after the first phase of Brexit and set further arbitrary deadlines for the infinitely more complicated second phase of Brexit dealing with trade. Rather than playing Russian roulette with people's jobs and economic well-being, would it not be better for the government to take a grown-up approach to these negotiations and remove any arbitrary deadlines to the conclusions of the negotiations?
There are no arbitrary deadlines. The deadline for agreement on the 31st of December is in the political declaration. If we were to take that out, we would be altering the political declaration. We're honouring the political declaration, and far from being belligerent, all we are simply doing is setting a deadline. When I was an editor in the world of newspapers, setting a deadline for correspondence was not an exercise in belligerence. It was a way of making sure that we could serve the people.
Or a trot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that we have higher standards in the EU in a number of areas, particularly, I would point out, in maternity, and it might be useful for the EU to recognise this in some of their discourse?
My honourable friend is absolutely bang on. Across the nations and the countries of the continent of Europe, there are different approaches to some of these questions, and it is the case that there are countries outside the European Union, like Norway, that have exemplary standards in environmental protection and also when it comes to maternity and social rights. The UK, like Norway, is a progressive, liberal, modern country, and that is something across this House that we should celebrate, and outside the European Union we can aim even higher.
Grant Davis.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows that Canada, South Korea, Japan aren't in the single market. They aren't in the customs union, so we're starting from a different position. And therefore, will he accept that if we do diverge from EU environmental standards and workers' rights, inevitably there'll be restrictions? And so isn't his plan really to lose British jobs and simply blame the EU? And wouldn't it be better to keep up the standards and keep up the trade, because people didn't vote to lose their jobs when they voted to leave the EU?
I completely understand where the honourable gentleman is coming from, but we've had a referendum, we've had a general election. In both, it was very clear that we were going to leave the single market and the customs union, take back control in the interest of the British people.
David Dewitt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the statement and the document to which my right honourable friend refers. I particularly welcome the clarification, the increased clarification and increased detail on the subjects of fisheries, not least that it's going to be wholly, and I'm quoting from the statement, a wholly separate agreement from the free trade agreement, where we'll take back control of our waters as an independent coastal state and will not link access to our waters to access to EU markets. Can my right honourable friend confirm to the House and to the constituents of Banff and Buchan, particularly the seafood sector, both catchers and the processing side of the sector, that we will retain sovereignty, we will get the best deal for our fishermen across the United Kingdom, despite the assertions from the EU and despite the seemingly wishful thinking sometimes from the members opposite on SNP benches?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. For folk in Banff and Buchan, Murray, and indeed across the United Kingdom, a sea of opportunity beckons when we leave the European Union, and it is a great, great pity that the SNP and the Scottish Government, despite the many talented members that it enjoys, still wants us to remain in the EU and in the common fisheries policy. It's one of a number of ways in which they would sell Scotland short, and it grieves my heart.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just following that response here, today has governments ignored the vote of Scotland in the referendum, ignored the compromise proposals from the Scottish Government, and they're showing they're willing to ride roughshod over the Seoul Convention. Now reneged on his offer, when his Cherry vote leave, that Scotland could have its own immigration policy. So what one of these aspects is strengthening the so-called precious union?
Well, we are respecting the referendum result. In 2014, the people of Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom, and sadly, this is a settled decision which the Scottish Government seeks to unpick to the detriment of all. And then, having voted to be in the United Kingdom, the whole United Kingdom voted to leave whole and entire from the European Union, and we are working to make sure that that democratic decision works in the interests of all.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement today? And can I say to him, as he knows, that primarily the UK is a service-based sector economy. And whilst I hear taking back borders means a separate treaty for fishing, which many in coastal communities would welcome, constituents in my constituency of Wimbledon are in financial services and probably represent more than are employed by the whole of fishing in the UK. On the basis we've talked about control of our money and taking back control of our money, why not a separate treaty for financial services? And if not, I've heard his comments on equivalence. Will you set out what the government's position on equivalence is in terms of the derivation period?
It is the case, as my honourable friend makes clear, financial services matter not just in Wimbledon but across the United Kingdom, and that is why we want to ensure, as is made clear in the document that we published today, that we wish to conclude an agreement which will make provision for financial stability, market integrity and investor and consumer protection for financial services. And it is also the case that we want to secure mutual recognition of professional qualifications as well, in order to ensure that everyone in our service sector can continue to have access to the opportunities in every market in which they currently work.
Elmore.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Minister for further information in relation to the chapter on digital? In the report, I quote, it says, open, secure and trustworthy online environment and encourage regulatory cooperation. With the government moving to tackle issues around online harms and the platforms, could he set out in more detail what he means by ensuring that there is cooperation on regulation in any future trading agreement?
Yes, absolutely. It is the case, as the honourable gentleman knows, that we are compliant with all the GDPR regulation that the EU introduced, and we want to make sure that we get an equivalency judgment from the EU on data adequacy, and on that basis that we can continue to ensure that the data flows, which are so integral to business and others, can continue in an appropriate way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Right honourable friend's statement, both for the clarity and the optimism included in it. I know the people of Montgomeryshire, and indeed the majority of the people of Wales, will welcome that. Can I ask him to meet with the Welsh farming unions to outline again that we will not be seeking to lower food standards and tackle some of the scaremongering? And indeed, if my right honourable friend wants to do that of a Welsh farmhouse breakfast, we can certainly do that in Montgomeryshire.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for making that point. Whether it's the Farmers Union of Wales or NFU Cymru, farmers in Wales have brilliant representation, including from my honourable friend, the member for Montgomeryshire, and there is nothing nicer than a Welsh farmhouse breakfast, apart from possibly an Ulster fry, or a bacon sandwich in Peterhead Harbour.
Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Minister states that the negotiation will take place without prejudice to the Northern Irish Protocol, but there's confusion in Northern Ireland where we hear from the EU that there will be no derogation from the rules, but we have reports over the weekend of your government seeking to find ways around the protocol, and yourself and your colleagues saying that there will still be unfettered access and no border in the Irish Sea. Can the Minister please describe in detail the crystal clarity you've referred to, how these irreconcilable aims will be married up, how people in Northern Ireland will finally get certainty after 3.5 years of bluster and stalled investment, and will he clarify what form the negotiation with the devolved administration will take?
Far from there being confusion, I hope that there is clarity that we will implement the withdrawal agreement, respect the Northern Ireland Protocol, and then conclude a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union that will work in the interests of the people of Northern Ireland and people across the United Kingdom. It is the case that I've had profitable conversations with both the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister in the preparation of our approach today. We won't always agree with every party in Northern Ireland, but all parties in Northern Ireland, including her own, have an important role to play in making sure that we deliver for all of the people of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for the reassurance he gives to our fisheries, which is particularly relevant to the fisheries in my constituency, beautiful Hastings and Rye. And does my right honourable friend agree that the point of leaving the EU is to enable us to make our own laws in our own way by politicians which we elect and who are accountable to the British people?
Well, honourable friend gets absolutely to the heart of the matter. Democratic accountability, as outlined brilliantly and eloquently by the father of the member for Leeds Central in this House and elsewhere, is something that all of us should celebrate and that leaving the European Union allows us to enhance.
Green.
The document rightly acknowledges the importance of the SIS2 database, which holds many millions of pieces of data on wanted and missing persons, including vulnerable children. The document also says that if progress is not made by June sufficient to suggest that there will be the basis of an agreement by September, the government will begin to make its own preparations for domestic priorities. Can the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster explain how he will protect this country properly if we have to sacrifice the access that we have now to millions of pieces of vital data and rely on an Interpol database that contains only a few 100,000 records?
The Honourable Lady makes a very important point. And it is the case that we would like to continue to have access to not just the Schengen Information System 2 database, but also PRUM, ECRIS and a number of other law enforcement and criminal justice tools. But of course, we will have to see what approach the European Union takes. I'm hopeful that they will take a pragmatic approach because they benefit just as much, if not more, from our participation in these databases as we do. But it is also the case that leaving the European Union does allow us, through control of our own borders and laws, to improve homeland security in a number of ways, and we will always act in the interests of the British people.
Flaxman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can my honourable friend confirm that the UK and the EU will trade together under an Australia-style agreement if one cannot be reached by the end of the year?
Friend is absolutely right. We want to have a comprehensive free trade agreement on the model that I've outlined in my statement, but if not, then there are other great countries, including Australia, New Zealand and of course the United States, that have a huge volume of trade with the EU without having an agreement of that kind.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. You don't level up by damaging foundations, and that's exactly what would happen to the economy by walking away in June, as the government's been briefing this morning. But also, as my honourable friend has said, you would do damage to our security. Now, the document says very clearly that there should be no role for the CJEU in resolving UK-EU disputes. So does that mean the government's happy not only to lose access potentially to databases crucial to our security, but also the European arrest warrant?
It is ultimately a question for the EU. We are clear that we want a relationship of sovereign equals. If the EU attaches to that relationship a requirement that we follow the jurisdiction of their courts, that is not a relationship of sovereign equals, and it will be the security of the EU that would be impinged as well. And I am sure that no European politician would willingly want to sacrifice the security of their people by taking anything other than a constructive approach.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Before I came to this place, I had a job representing the banking industry in negotiations with in the wake of the Brexit referendum with the EU, the European Parliament, the Commission, the Council, as well as the Bank of England and the Treasury, on what sort of relationship we want with the EU after Brexit. And one thing we came to realise quite quickly, as did the Bank of England, and Mark Carney has spoken on this point, that as a global financial centre, to be a rule taker and have no say over our prudential regulation would be a threat to financial stability for the UK. Does my right honourable friend agree that actually we have to be very careful and there's a real threat to becoming a rule taker for financial services?
100% spot on, totally correct.
Speaker, yesterday as a member of the Defence Select Committee I heard from Professor Malcolm Charners of RUSI, who stated the risks to the UK's essential alliance relationships are greater now than they have ever been for many decades. So I wonder if the Secretary of State could advise the House why the statement on our future relationships with the European Union and about maintaining and say absolutely nothing about maintaining and improving defence.
Well, when it comes to maintaining and improving defence, we have a network of relationships, including, of course, our membership of NATO, the strongest and most durable alliance for freedom that the world has ever known. But when it also comes to defending this country, one of the most perilous things that we could do would be to follow the Scottish Government's approach of breaking up the United Kingdom and the Scottish Government's approach of unilateral nuclear disarmament. I'm afraid that the SNP's position on defence, like its position on so many other issues, would mean that the Scottish people would be less safe as a direct result of their ideological attachment to separation.
Matthew Pennicook.
Mr. Speaker, in light of the Minister's remarks on level playing field, can I ask him about competition policy and governance arrangements? Is it the Government's position that in relation to commitments on workers' rights, on environmental protections, consumer and social standards, that the Government would accept them being subject to any dispute resolution mechanism agreed to as part of the wider agreement?
It is the case that there will be, there was a list I know that the Honourable Gentleman put forward. I'll come back to each of those in correspondence. Some of them would be covered by dispute resolution mechanisms, others may not be.
Mr. Speaker, Scotland also cast its biggest ever voting proposition when it voted 62% to remain in the EU. More people in Scotland voted to remain in the EU than voted to remain within the United Kingdom. And also that was using the franchise of the UK Government. Had 16 and 17-year-olds been trusted the way we do in Scotland, trust our youth, there would have been a bigger proportion to remain within the EU. Does he truly believe withholding the sovereign right of the Scottish people is a sustainable position going forward? And while protecting the sovereignty of the UK, is he prepared to deny the sovereignty of Scotland?
Well, I know that it is the case that the Scottish Nationalist Party will always... I don't know why... I'm sorry, facts are shields that win a ding, as Robert Brown said. I'm afraid the representatives on that bench are nationalists. They are nationalists. They put the separation of the smashing up of the United Kingdom ahead of anything else. Some of them are personally decent and kind people, but I'm afraid they're nationalists. And the reason they object so much is that when the mask comes off and we recognise the ideological heart of the SNP, they didn't like it up them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If agreement's reached, it's estimated there's going to be a need for about 50,000 new customs officers. Is it feasible to recruit and train that many people in less than 6 months, and who's going to foot the bill for it?
Good question.
Yes, it is, and the government stands behind it.
Stephen Farry.
Does the Minister recognise that even the most far-reaching and comprehensive free trade agreement is sadly still going to see regulatory checks and rules of origin checks down the Irish Sea? And as such, beyond simply giving a rhetorical commitment around the implementation of the protocol, can the Minister assure not just the House but his negotiating partners in the European Union that the Government is actually preparing to implement that protocol?
We will ensure that the protocol is appropriately implemented, and we will also ensure unfettered access for businesses in Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK market.
Patricia Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, Brexit will be extremely damaging for Scotland in a whole range of ways. The difference between myself and the Secretary of State is that he's a British nationalist and I'm a Scottish nationalist.
Indeed.
But can he tell me if he thinks that Brexit imposed on Scotland will increase or decrease constitutional tensions across the UK?
Britain leaving the European Union will mean that there is a greater degree of harmony between every part of the United Kingdom. And I recognise that will be a disappointment to the Scottish Nationalist Party in its restless search for grievance, dissension and division. But one of the things that I can't help saying is that even though I profoundly disagree with the SNP, it's so lovely to have so many SNP MPs here in the Westminster Parliament, and I know that for many, many, many years to come, there will be representation for Scotland here in Westminster, and that's a lovely thing.
We now come to the next ministerial statement. It's the Lord President of the Council and the Leader of the House of Commons, the Right Honourable Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The business for the week commencing the 2nd of March will include Monday, the 2nd of March, second reading of the Medicines and Medical Devices Bill, followed by procedural motion relating to the High-Speed Rail West Midlands Crew Bill, followed by the House will be asked to agree all outstanding estimates. Tuesday, and welcome Madam Deputy Speaker to the Chair, Tuesday, the 3rd of March, proceedings on the Supply and Appropriation Anticipation and Adjustments Bill, followed by committee and remaining stages of the Prisoners' Disclosure of Information about Victims Bill, followed by motion to approve a statutory instrument relating to the draft statutory parental bereavement pay General Regulations 2020 and draft parental bereavement leave regulations 2020. Wednesday, the 4th of March, Opposition Day, 5th allotted day, there will be a debate on flooding, followed by a debate on health inequalities. Both debates will arise on a motion in the name of the official opposition. Thursday, the 5th of March, general debate on International Women's Day. Friday, the 6th of March, the House will not be sitting. The provisional business for the week commencing the 9th of March will include Monday, the 9th of March, second reading of the Birmingham Commonwealth Games Bill, Lords. Tuesday, the 10th of March, remaining stages of the Telecommunications Infrastructure Leasehold Property Bill. Wednesday, the 11th of March, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, will deliver his budget statement. Thursday, the 12th of March, continuation of the budget debate. Friday, the 13th of March, private members' bills.
Shadow Leader of the House, Valerie Vance.
And on that note, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Leader of the House for the forthcoming business? I'm pleased to see the Committee of Selection have now met and that the select committees are on the order paper. And just to clarify, it had nothing to do with the Labour Party. It was, in fact, the government that were delaying it. I hope the motion will be on the order paper on Monday for the House to approve. Could I ask the Leader of the House also for the list of ministerial responsibilities? There have been a lot of new appointments. And can the Leader of the House confirm that any of the new recruits that come into number 10, including those who are replacing those, particularly in the light of the statement by my honourable friend, the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove, and the replacement of his staff, that they have in fact been security vetted and they won't be given security briefings? I understand someone who's recently been removed from number 10 was not security vetted. They need to go through the proper Cabinet Office procedures. I don't know if the Leader of the House is aware, Madam Deputy Speaker, but the Court of Appeal gave judgment this morning on Heathrow Airport. Could the Leader of the House find time for a statement on Heathrow expansion? If he doesn't, there'll probably be an urgent question, so he might as well just make a statement. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, as the Cabinet Office Briefing Room A and the Cabinet Office Briefing Room B and the Prime Minister's Wellingtons lie unused, the climate emergency is taking its toll on our citizens. They're watching their furniture go down the river. We had a record 632 flood alerts on one day alone. The statement on Monday by the Secretary of State said nothing about repairing the flood defences. The Labour government increased this to 10% a year, but under the Tories this was cut to 1.2%. Now, a Labour government in Wales is looking after the distressed folk by giving them £500 and £1,000 if they don't have insurance. That's practical help. Can he perhaps ask the Welsh Secretary of State, who's going to come to the Chamber later, about the 10 million infrastructure payment, one-off payment that the Government of Wales requires? And I'm sure he'll want to provide time for an updated statement when the Prime Minister visits Shrewsbury this weekend. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's no debate on the Marmot report in government time. He said this: the last decade has seen those in disadvantaged areas face declining health, with life expectancy falling, especially for women. Professor Marmot called the damage to the nation's health shocking. If health has stopped improving, that means society has stopped improving. Now, the Leader of the House can't dismiss Professor Marmot because the Prime Minister said himself yesterday he worked with Professor Marmot. He also said, Professor Marmot said, that employment, good employment, is important. So while the government boasts more employment, there is a massive increase in people on zero contracts. 1 million people, 9% of those under 25, are now on these contracts. Other countries have actually banned these contracts. When will the government have a debate on the perniciousness of these contracts? It's like, for those people on these contracts, like walking a tightrope without a safety net. That's not fair and right. Resorting to volunteer food banks is not a safety net. And why haven't we had a debate on the £7 million contract to private US firms so that they can screen what they're calling our most expensive patients? Can he rule out that people will not be denied treatment? Or are we getting into the deserving and undeserving area? The next step is actually going to be screening people. What is this obsession that this government has on screening people out? So could we have a debate on that? Well, the select committees hopefully will be up and running. Maybe they'll be able to report to the House. We have this absurd situation where the Deputy Health Minister in Iran has got COVID-19, and we have British citizens who are lying in jail having done nothing. Nazanin, Anousheh and Kylie need to come home. They need to have proper treatment. An Iranian MP has said that they should be released on compassionate and humanitarian grounds. Now, maybe this is a job for the United Nations or the World Health Organization, or even my right honourable friend, the member for Skipton and Ripon, who did a fantastic job on Northern Ireland. Maybe he can do some negotiating, as the government don't want to do that on behalf of their British citizens. I'd like the Leader of the House, please, to clarify a point made by my honourable friend, the member for Central Ayrshire. She asked the Secretary of State for Health about those who self-isolate, that they're not penalised. Now, in terms of their employment rights. Now, the Secretary of State actually said only those who self-isolate on medical advice will be protected. Now, we've got many people on 0 hours contract. They won't be protected. They are self-isolating to protect our citizens. Could we have a clarification that everyone, whether they get medical advice or not, will be protected and have their employment rights protected? There was a helpful email from the House authorities on COVID-19 and what members can do. Could the Leader of the House please ensure that up-to-date hand gel is available for public areas like the public gallery and those staff who are interfacing with the public, so that they're also safe? Madam Deputy Speaker, the Speaker's chaplain held a service for Ash Wednesday in St Mary's Undercroft with Father Canon Pat Brown for Ash Wednesday. We're pleased to welcome Canon Patricia Hillis, and she'll be inaugurated next week. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to wish everybody, Welsh or not, a happy St David Day on Sunday.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I noticed that when the Right Honourable Lady gets up to stand, my honourable friend, the member for Wellingborough, whoops in delight, which he doesn't do when I get up to stand. So clearly the the Right Honourable Lady is doing something right. I'm glad to report that select committees will be set up. It has taken longer than anticipated. Inevitably, a reshuffle in the midst of it meant that there were some changes as to who would be on the committees, but that is now going ahead, and the government is very keen to get that scrutiny up and running. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for asking for the list of ministerial responsibilities.